I'm Amelia Peterson. I'm in my third year in the Ph.D. in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm working with Associate Professor Jal Mehta and a group of graduate students on a project looking at human-centered systems design in education. So in our process of research, a team of us are going to different sites around the US and Canada, and we're going into districts that are going through a process of what we're describing as human-centered systems design. We're talking to teachers in classrooms, we're talking to people at the district level who have been supporting this process. We're also talking to the creators of the original sort of design methodologies that's being used in that particular context. And we're trying to understand how the process is being experienced by all these different people, and also how the experience is translating into actual impact on practice. Human-centered systems design really describes a kind of version of design thinking that has been adapted for use in education and to tackle systemic kinds of problems. So a number of these examples of processes have different kinds of names, but the important thing about them is that they all feature really more of an emphasis on iteration and going through cycles of change and adaptation. Because ultimately this is all about improving the learning experience for students. And so what we want to understand is that whole chain of how design processes, whether that's about creating a new curriculum, whether that's about improving the way that teachers work together collaboratively, whether that's about creating a new kind of pedagogy in a context such as project-based learning, how that's all feeding through into the actual practice and the impact on students. One type of human-centered systems design that we've looked at a lot is an inquiry cycle, which is something that many teachers in different kinds of contexts have used to improve their practice over time. And inquiry cycles come under different kinds of names. One of the ones used here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education is DataWise. Up in Canada, lots of teachers go through a process called spirals of inquiry. In New Zealand, something called cycles of inquiry is popular. And what these processes all share in common is that they involve a kind of continuous iterative movement through, but they also start with identifying a problem of practice or something that teachers want to work on in their context to improve the learning experience for their students. And so we've been looking at this from the perspective of human-centered systems design as an example where they're starting by identifying a problem in a human-centered way. So the example I particularly like is called Spirals of Inquiry, and it starts by asking students questions about how they're experiencing schools. One of the questions is, can you name 2 adults in this school who think that you can be successful? And it's actually a really interesting sort of telling question when teachers are confronted by the perspective of their students and how their students are experiencing the school environment. So we see that as a really interesting specific example of the empathy stage of design thinking, where teachers are coming to understand their students' experience of the school and how they see how teachers feel about them. And then the next stage of the spiral would be to sort of go through this whole scanning process, understand how all the students are experiencing, and then to identify a change that you as a teacher can make to improve how your students are experiencing their learning. And so that's kind of the stage where you're honing in on a problem, on a challenge that is going to become your design challenge, and you're going to make some improvement. So you decide on the change you can make, and then you're implementing that, and you're going to be iterating on it, you're going to be improving it, tweaking it as you go along. And the way that you do that is really by looking for the impact that your change has had on your students. So then you need to be going out, looking for evidence of the change, looking for what's going on for the students, maybe carrying out that scanning process again in terms of asking them how that's changed. And then just continually working through that cycle. And that's why it's known as a spiral, because it just iterates round and round. So we see this as a really interesting form of human-centered systems design that is carried out and really driven by teachers, because they're the ones carrying out that inquiry process, making the changes, seeing the impact on their students, and then going back to the beginning and continually iterating. Everyone wants to improve education quickly and effectively, and you would think that if you've been through a design process and created a new, better model of schooling, you should be able to spread that to many different kinds of communities. The challenge, of course, is that every context is different, every community is different, and effective schooling probably looks a little different everywhere. So one of the problems we're trying to grapple with at the moment is design something that has to constantly happen in order to adapt models to different kinds of contexts? And it seems like maybe it does, and we're not sure on that yet. The jury's still out. But there's definitely a regular pitfall of design thinking to assume that once you've created your product and can laminate it, it's then something that's good enough because it's been created by a rigorous design process to be used anywhere. And we're not sure that that's the case. So design thinking can be appropriate for lots of situations, but there are going to be some kinds of problems where I think it can lead us down a wrong path. And particularly, design thinking in the way that it was initially conceived was to create individual products. And therefore, sometimes the goal when you're going through a design process is to sort of optimize or create some perfect solution. And in education, we have to remember that education has many different purposes. You know, a school might have civic purposes, it might have economic purposes, it might have moral education purposes, as well as just sort of straightforward conveying knowledge purposes. So when you're trying to fulfill all of those different purposes at once, if you have a design process that is aiming towards only one kind of solution, you might forget that actually there are lots of important things in a school life which are there for a reason, but are maybe not contributing towards, say, a goal of increasing test scores, even though that's an important goal in and of itself. But sometimes a design process can lead us to sort of narrow in on one particular goal because we want to see, you know, is our solution working? Are we improving? Are we getting there? And we can sort of forget about some of the other purposes that we have that might be important. If someone wants to use the design thinking process to address systemic challenges, one of the first things to do is to really think about, can you see your system? It just makes it easier to think about, okay, if I'm changing something to do with curriculum, that's going to have implications for assessment, that's going to have implications for teacher development, but it's also going to have implications for things like what technology I'm using, how I need to engage with parents about this change to make sure that they understand it. There's all these different pieces that you want to have in play. It's really hard for schools sometimes to coordinate bringing together all the different people who are involved in the educational process, which of course includes parents and students and teachers, but also maybe employers, maybe other people from the local community who have learning resources or can be sites of learning that you might want to get involved in your new sort of learning experience that you're creating. So one of the ways you can think about this is to break down the problem that you're tackling so that the different people are involved at different stages of the design process. So on the one hand, you can create parts of the new solution of whatever it is that you're creating separately and just have those involved who are most closely involved with that part of the new solution. On the other hand, there are definitely going to be moments where you need to bring together all of the different stakeholders in order to understand how they're all going to perceive it. Because the absolute downfall often of some of the innovations we see in education is that if it doesn't make sense to parents, if it doesn't really seem meaningful to them, there's going to be pushback. And so having them involved in the process while something is being created can often be a really important way, both to get their insight and buy-in, but also for them to be able to raise issues that probably aren't visible from the perspective of a school. So there's definitely a case for bringing everybody into the design process at some point, but it's definitely also a case for being smart about when you bring them in and which aspects of the new thing you're creating need those people's input the most.